Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm Forrest, Inslee, inviting you to explore more creation-centered ways of thinking and being, and deeper connection to our places. In this episode, I'll be in conversation with Ruth Padilla deBorst to learn more about an intentional community of people in Costa Rica that includes the more than human members in the ecologies around them and bears witness to the world to a more environmentally just and sustainable way of living life together. Now, if you've listened to the last few episodes of the Earthkeepers podcast, you'll be aware that one of the priorities of the podcast this year is exploring ways we can practically engage in bold action in the pursuit of social and environmental justice. We're also talking a lot about how we can mobilize together in communities of resistance and defiant hope. Our guest, Ruth Padilla deBorst, will give us an inside look at a group of people in Costa Rica who are modeling those values as they live together in an intentional community called Casa Adobe. In the last podcast episode, you'll have heard James Amadon and I in conversation with our buddy Ben Lowe, the director of A Rocha USA. In that episode, Ben spoke of exciting happenings in the broader network of A Rocha International, including the news that Casa Adobe has come under the umbrella of A Rocha Partners. For that reason, I thought it would be fun to co-host with my friend Joe Swinney, the director of communications at A Rocha International. Welcome to you, Joe and Ruth. Most of our listeners know you, Joe, because you've been a guest on the podcast and also have co-hosted the Earthkeepers podcast with me. But for our newer listeners, perhaps you could tell us where you are these days and what you're invested in.
That's a really nice way of prompting some information on what I'm invested in. Not stocks and shares, primarily relationships, I would say. I am based in Bath in the UK. I work as Director of Communications for A Rocha International, and I am invested heavily in my family, in my church, in a big pile of books that I'm trying to work my way through and learning to crochet at the moment.
Tell us about your role with A Rocha International.
I am primarily a storyteller, but I'm also trying to translate a lot of data into accessible ways into engaging with creation care as a Christian in a fairly hopeless situation, trying to find ways to inspire people to do what they can where they are, to remain hopeful, to remain active, and to see that God cares deeply for everything that He's made. So that's the kind of bigger explanation. In terms of day-to-day, it's websites, publications, social media, training, supporting our national organizations, branding, that kind of thing. I'm not bored.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind introducing our guest today.
Yeah, so Ruth and I, we have never met in person, but I've been hearing your name, Ruth, around my world for a really long time. I think like decades and decades, and we're now part of the same A Rocha family. So it's a really great pleasure to be having this conversation. Ruth, could you tell us a bit about where you are and what you are invested in?
So thanks for having me, Forrest and Joe. It's wonderful to be with you. My name is Ruth Padilla deBorst, and I am sitting here in my beautiful office in Casa Adobe in Santo Domingo, Heredia, Costa Rica. This is the base of A Rocha Costa Rica. I'm originally from Argentina, but I have been here living along with my husband and our intentional community here in Costa Rica for some 17 years now.
Joe, let me ask you to help us understand this new development where Ruth's organization has come under the umbrella of A Rocha. What's the nature of that association and of the network in general? And what do such partnerships look like?
Yeah, so A Rocha began in 1983 as one project under a trust. The trust was in the UK, the project was in Portugal, and it stayed very much under the radar for the first 12 years. And it was very, very local in southern Portugal with one wetland. But in that time, hundreds and hundreds of people from around the world came through and took the idea back to their own locations and were very keen to bring a Christian expression of environmentalism to their own situation. And so after the 12 years, it started to grow at a quite a big rate. And the model was to stay very much contextualized so that each national expression would be national in character and leadership. We share 5 core commitments, and we share a vision and a mission. But as new organizations have come, they've come out of the soil of that particular country and in response to the ecosystem and whatever the challenges might be of that place. So A Rocha Costa Rica is the latest in what we call a family of organizations. We are in tight relationship. We have responsibilities and we have the blessings of connection between us. And we're also independently governed. We have our own boards, our own finances, and our own ways of working. A Rocha Costa Rica is the newest family member, very much feel that we belong to one another. And A Rocha Costa Rica is bringing all sorts of new life and talent and vibrancy into the mix, which is blessing the whole. And we are very much hoping that what was Casa Adobe will benefit too from the cross-pollination and being part of a global movement of people and work.
Ruth, last time I spoke to someone from your community, things were sort of in development and growing, and I understand that there's actually more that has happened since then, a few years ago. Maybe you could catch us up on what your organization is doing in different sites around Costa Rica.
Yes, happily. So when you talked last, Forrest, we were pretty incipient, very committed to creation care, to recognizing not just humans as our neighbors, but recognizing that the river that runs near our neighborhood is also our neighbor. And so we were leaning into that and guiding trips, picnics by the river and cleanup and advocating for a restored relationship between the neighbors and our other neighbor, the river. And we were doing some composting in the neighborhood, some workshops with neighborhood people, and gardening and recycling our gray waters and such. Since then, we have definitely grown at leaps and bounds. We have not abandoned any of that. That has continued, actually has been strengthened. We have a whole reforestation project by the river, and we're advocating for the creation of a natural urban park, which is a category that exists in Costa Rica. So we're working at different levels, both very grassroots with the neighbors, but also at governmental, local, and state levels for that park. But then also, just about 2 years ago now, we received a lease on a property in the cloud forest, just a drive up the hill from us. Casa Adobe has a forested area, but also a retreat center. It used to be a hotel, and then it was a campus. So we have this as our conservation site, and we're doing a lot of research on fauna and flora, and excited about what we're discovering, the diversity of bat life and sloth and tapir and puma and all kinds of frogs and toads that are actually pretty unique. One of them, actually, we just had a scientist come down, Jeremy Linzel from A Rocha International, who helped us recognize that a certain, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it was a toad or a frog, but is unique to this area in the entire world. So we're just really excited about the possibility of caring for this, having it be a base for environmental education for children, for churches. And less than a month from now, we're having a retreat, Healing River, Hope for the Watershed, bringing people from North America mainly to not just do tourism and consume Costa Rica, but to learn alongside us and engage in visioning how we can partner in our response, in our seeking environmental justice for people and place. I mentioned Casa Adobe, then Casa Nube, and a third site we have is Casa Esperanza, which means hope home, that's on the border with Nicaragua, on the northern border of Costa Rica, where we have been accompanying migrants and refugees. But the environmental dimension is also very present there because we have a thriving garden, a sensory garden that is helping particularly children work through some of the trauma that they have been experiencing as people on the move and seeing all kinds of abuse and such. And so there's a sensory garden. This garden also provides food for the kitchen to feed the migrants, but it's also part of their experience of some level of healing in the midst of so much pain.
Ruth, many places where A Rocha has started is in response to very depleted nature and desecrated landscapes. And Costa Rica is a world leader in biodiversity. I think the rest of the world has a lot to learn from how you've stewarded, cared for, allowed nature be pretty pristine and glorious from all I hear. I'm absolutely longing to come. And I just wonder what kind of role you are going to play. Is there a need to be convincing people to take care of the world? Or is it more maintaining what you have and reminding people that it will stay well cared for if they're not working at it? Or is it not as lush and perfect as it looks from the outside?
My response is yes to both your questions, in the sense that on the one hand, yes, Costa Rica has, at a global scale, determined to have some pretty high standards in terms of carbon footprint and such. So there is that reality, but there also, at the very same time, is quite a bit of greenwashing and green tourism that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground. So, for example, the river Virilla, right by us, is one of the most polluted rivers in the whole of Central America. And there haven't necessarily been measures taken to guarantee that the runoff is properly managed, or that a variety of conditions that need to be put in place for it to actually be restored to where it used to be, where our neighbors used to swim and fish in it. Our neighbors, living members of the community. So it wasn't even that long ago to see the deterioration of that river. So it's a both and. It's a let's live up to what we say we are, to the picture we want to paint about Costa Rica, but let's also lean into sustaining, conserving, caring for what is there.
Ruth, I know Casa Adobe, you mentioned that it was an intentional community. And has that changed the way that you've cared for your non-human neighbors, doing that together and that being part of your life as a community?
Most definitely. You know, our world is so bent on consumption, on accumulation, on the imaginary of constant growth and more is better. Living as an intentional community where our Christian values impact not just what we think or how we act out there, but the way we live daily, means to me it's really difficult to imagine caring thoroughly for creation if we don't get off that train of consumption and accumulation and constant growth and such as our imaginary. An intentional community, what's intentional about it is the determination to live in an alternative way. That means what? For example, right now, we're about 5 different family units. If each of us had our own place, our own refrigerator, our own microwave, our own everything, we obviously have a carbon footprint way larger than by sharing. We share, so we reduce our carbon footprint. By sharing, we also make more sustainable the processes of composting, of gardening, of caring from the small to the large for creation. And it also nourishes this alternative imaginary where we don't feel deprived because we share. We actually feel all the more fulfilled and plentiful because of sharing. So it's hard for me to imagine not trying to find a way to be coherent and hold our creation care with integrity, not just as a program, not just as something out there, but as something that affects the way we live day in and day out.
Ruth, I teach community development at the graduate level. And one thing that I've noticed about the field of community development in general is it's got such a bias toward human being. Even at the expense of the environment, human well-being is paramount. And so in our classes, we've tried to problematize that and help people to think about community in a much broader, community of creation sense. And in that case, you can then include your more than human neighbors around you and take their well-being into account as well. I love the fact that you guys are very overt about that in your community, that you see the more than human members surrounding you as actually part of the community. So I would love to hear about some of the practical ways that that dynamic is lived out day to day in the community. How do you include everyone in creation?
Yeah, it's definitely been a progressive awareness building among us, where we don't just see the river or the sloth up at Casa Adobe as external to us, but as siblings in a way. It's a process of recognizing how we belong to one another and how dependent, absolutely dependent we are on the rest of creation. Terry LeBlanc from the First Nations in Canada. One of the challenges he issued to me, decades ago, was, Ruth, tell me one time when you gave more to the rest of creation than she gave to you. We are just a part of this interwoven web of life. That's the way life is sustained. We are not without the air and the water and the sustenance the land and the animals and the plants give us. And so concretely, I guess it just leads us to a sense of awe and respect and care that is not just about what it does for us, but of how we are mutually supporting of one another in the way we garden, in the way we deal with pests, in the way we tread on the land we're privileged to connect to.
I actually have a question about the river as a neighbor and whether you've had people find that an uncomfortable concept, if you've had people worry that you're moving into a sort of alternative spirituality or giving personification of value which is beyond the bounds of Orthodox Christian understanding.
Yeah, definitely. We have people saying, all that ecological stuff, that's pagan. You're worshiping nature. But back in 2009, I was asked to present at a MICA Global gathering on climate change. And as a theologian, missiologist, I had talked about issues of justice and explored biblically and such. And I was concerned about creation care, but I hadn't integrated my theology and the ecological concern as thoroughly as I was challenged to by being asked to present some Bible expositions at that gathering, which is where I met your father and began the connection with A Rocha back in that gathering. And so there began an exploration. I've never arrived. I continue discovering how deeply integrated the biblical worldview is in relation to the whole of creation. You read Job, and you were just mentioning, Forrest, about the extra focus on humanity and development. And here's the story of Job, which is a story about somebody who's suffering as a person. And yet the book is full of God challenging Job to not just think about himself, but to recognize how he's part of this entire life-sustaining system that God has created with beauty and diversity and goodness. And so I feel like we just constantly growing in our understanding that from the very beginning, creation was designed as something beautiful, incredibly diverse. And that is part of what God celebrated and said, this is good. What's good is that it's diverse, it's thriving with life and bugs and bees and everything that is so intricately and delicately balanced to sustain life. I think we too often think about worship as some little portion of a Sunday service or something, but actually recognizing the wonder and standing in awe of this diverse creation, that is worship. And so recognizing the river as our sister, as our sibling, is an expression of worship of God, not of the river, but of the Creator whose spirit breathes breath into every living thing constantly, including us in the same way as the bee that just flew by the flowers in our garden.
And the river and all that live in it are our fellow worshippers. Like Psalm 19, it says everything is pouring forth speech. It's overwhelmed with all it has to say about who God is. And so it's where the glory of God is expressed. It's all under his sovereignty and reflecting back to him the joy of him making it.
Speaking of the distance between people and the rest of creation, when I last spoke to folks at Casa Adobe a few years ago, they talked about the river in very relational terms, loving terms even, and they spoke of the work of helping to clean up the river and giving access to the river to people was actually a form of reconciliation, bringing beings together that had been separated. Is that still how you see the work with the river in particular, as a work of reconciliation?
Very much, very much. When we talk about the community of creation, as I was mentioning, our neighbors used to have a relationship with the river. But as it got polluted, as the factories dumped in it, then they just turned their back on it, and they themselves started throwing trash down the side of the river, because if you don't see it, then it doesn't exist. And so it totally is a shift of, hey, let's turn our faces back towards the river. Let's relate again to it. Let's restore that broken relationship. And that'll strengthen even the humanity of the neighbors, because in as much as we restore our relationship to the rest of creation, we restore the image of God in us, because God is this God of creativity and diversity and beauty. And so we become more fully what God intends us to be as human beings, in as much as and as we restore our relationship to the rest of the members of the created community.
You had mentioned Terry LeBlanc as someone who has challenged you to think differently. We've often interviewed Indigenous folks. We have learned so much from them about how to have a different sort of worldview that is more inclusive, that's more respectful of creation, even to the point of personalizing all aspects of nature. I'm wondering, in your context, have there been influences of the indigenous people of Costa Rica on the way that you think and behave with the rest of creation?
Interestingly, Costa Rica never had a dominant, powerful, established civilization of indigenous people like Mexico, Guatemala, or Peru, Ecuador, the Andean region. So the indigenous people of Costa Rica have been very marginalized and pushed into little corners that are not that present or visible in the big urban areas. So we have not necessarily had a ton of contact with them. But we have been very inspired by indigenous people. You know, I'm originally from Argentina, and so I have had contact with indigenous people from Argentina. I lived many years in Ecuador and was shaped by the indigenous people of the Andean region. And we are very connected to some friends who are indigenous Kuna Nation people from Panama and such, who are very much part of our broader extended community. And actually, a young woman who is on our advisory board as A Rocha Costa Rica is from the Ocean Nation of the Kuna people in the Caribbean. So they've been our teachers. They have inspired, they have challenged, they have helped us realize it's not just about what we do, but about our epistemology, about how we believe we know. Because one of the problems with the Western colonial efforts has been telling us that the only way to know is through dominance and through imposition and through head knowledge. The cognitive stuff is so dominant. And so we've learned to perceive the world in more relational terms and more mutuality and reciprocity and mutual dependence and such from our indigenous friends from across Latin America, definitely.
We have someone on our board who is Native American, and she has taught us to speak in the language of family. And so the goal really of living well in the world is to be a good relation in the family of creation. And that really does change the way you think and act, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for many Christians, first, if it's not dominance and abuse of creation, a maturation has been saying, oh, we need to be stewards. But the steward is still above. The steward is still capable of manipulating and such. And so there needs to be a graduating from that to recognizing our relationship, right? That it's not one over the other.
I just interviewed Brandy Woodley. Randy was actually on the podcast talking about democracy because he's got a new Substack series coming out called Make Democracy Great Again. His main point was that democracy means including all voices at the table when you're making decisions, when you're trying to solve problems. When you extrapolate from that, that really means that beings in creation have to have a voice somehow at the table when we're talking about solving these great challenges that we're facing. I'm curious, I haven't figured this out myself, but what is it to include all voices at the table?
Yeah, I feel there's a big learning curve there to actually acknowledge the voice of the animals and the plants and the rest of creation. I feel like we're in the process of growing into that acknowledgement. I don't know that we have a quick formula about what it looks like. It's more of an increasing recognition.
I'm aware that Costa Rica is a massive cultural melting pot. I'm wondering if there's a kind of tangible difference in different cultural groups in how they would live alongside the rest of creation, whether people with more northern roots are more tending towards the consumerist approach.
Yes. We all tend to live towards the imaginaries, the way we construct our idea about what the good life is and how people should live and such. And Costa Rica is interesting in that, as I was mentioning earlier, there was no significant mining in Costa Rica in pre-Columbian times. So there were no strong, settled civilizations of indigenous people. So when the Spaniards, conquistadores, came to the Americas, they didn't see this as a high priority place. They wanted gold, they wanted metals, they wanted wealth to take back to Europe. So the people that settled here were actually like the third and fourth brothers of the Spanish or Portuguese families. And there was never the development of huge land holdings. It was all more family sustenance, small plots. So from the very inception of the nation, it was a more equal, less economically disparate nation. And the ideal is very beautifully represented in a song that says, all I need is my little garden so I can grow my little corn plantation, and I have my little house, my little hut, and my little wife. It's a little machista, but my little brown wife. But it's all little. It's modest. It's an imaginary of sufficiency. Contrast dramatically with the influx of tourists, and a lot of retirees come from North America because this is quite a peaceful place. It has no army, so it hasn't had a whole lot of social unrest. It's a calm place. It's beautiful. The temperature is beautiful. And so then you get these big resorts and development for wealthy people. And so you do have a crust of Costa Rica that aspires to have more and to travel to the US to buy their designer clothes and all this stuff that is very counter to a sustainable lifestyle. And so there is a bit of a tension between those imaginaries, the idea of sufficiency and the idea of needing more and more and staying up to the latest fashion in global competition and such.
Joe had mentioned earlier that a lot of the world looks to Costa Rica for inspiration to see how creation care can be done on a bigger systemic scale. And it makes me wonder if that reality has to do with history as well.
Yes. And then, 80 years ago, with the abolishment of the army, course, you know the history of Latin America and so many military coups. So this one president was pretty savvy. He said, I don't want a military coup, let's abolish the army. But it meant that the country invested in education and health instead of a standing army and weapons and all of that. And so it has been a less unequal society. And I think that also gave them the latitude and the space to recognize, hey, part of sustainable lifestyle is caring for the land. And so such a huge proportion of the country is dedicated to national parks, for example. And so there are protected areas already built into the system. Of course, that is eroding. And that is one of the things we lament and we're trying to counter. Because with the neoliberal capitalist mode of operation, it's hard to stick with those commitments. And so the recent governments have not been proactive in caring for these parks or in keeping the social structure as it has been. Next week, we have elections here, and one of the big contestations is what is the model that will be followed? What is the dream? What is the imaginary that will make this country in its next phase?
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm. There's a children's story called The Giving Tree, where the tree ends up as a stump rather than a productive fruit tree. The great lie is that we can ruin it and not be impacted. Whereas if it's doing well, we do well. It's all interdependent. I wonder if you can see that correlation between a really healthy ecosystem and a healthy population. And conversely, if it is degrading, can you see that in the human statistics of health and well-being?
Yes, so much of Central America. One of the things that we are learning also is how do we continue engaging with the reality that birds migrate? What about people? People are forced. People migrate, but birds are free to migrate. People are cut off from certain things and possibilities, and climate change is forcing so many people to be on the move. And so the desertification of a whole swath of Central America is provoking just countless families being forced to move. And so the tie-in between the reality of climate and creation care and the vulnerability of people is in our face daily at A Rocha Costa Rica because we have this site on the border. It's a beautiful spot. There's incredible birding in that area and everything, but the plight of people being trafficked, it's just a really dramatic picture. And as I say, these things are very tied together, people and place.
Ruth, there's a lot of environmental injustice and exploitation happening in the U.S. these days. And as you know, under the Trump administration, we've not only stopped making progress toward better care of the planet, we've actually taken huge steps backward as a country.
Backwards, yes.
And that is just very upsetting for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And among our listeners for the podcast, there are people who are quite desperate to find ways to fight back in more impactful and systemic ways beyond learning how to recycle better, right? We're trying to find ways to actually push back against these major changes that on a systemic level are doing so much damage. I just wonder, for those of us who are feeling the drive to resist in more impactful and systemic ways, and who want to unite with others to do the same, what practical advice could you offer? And I ask this knowing that you've spent enough time in the States, in various places that you know what's going on culturally and politically, probably in ways that most people don't.
Yeah. One is Christians need to be willing and step into biblical lament and not denialism. We need to face the reality as stark as it is and not stick our heads in the sand because this is heavy, it is tragic, and we need to name it as such and be willing to do so theologically, not to lose faith, but to name that which is wrong and lament it. And so in our community, we've been writing psalms of lament about these things. We often, as Western and particularly evangelical Christians, tend to want to get quick action formulas, but maybe we need to pause and be willing to feel the weight of it. And then I think we cannot just tweak the system. We need some radical alternative modes of living. As you say, it's not just about, oh, we can, encourage our city to recycle. Yes, sure. But we need to learn to live differently as humanity in this world. We kind of define ourselves not as a model of anything, but as an experiment, as experimentation in living differently. And I think if more and more of us took seriously what it means to live as part of the creation community and allowed that to determine our value system, our lifestyles, our aspirations, it would make a difference. And then, of course, I think there are people gifted and with capacities to intervene at different levels of the political and social realm to find alternative energy sources, to explore them and adopt them and push for them and advocate for them and put creativity, energy, savviness into alternatives. So it's not one answer, it's a multifaceted call to respond and to not give up hope in spite of this very, very backward trend.
It sounds to me like most of what you think about as viable alternatives for resistance are very community oriented.
Very much so. I don't believe this is a call for individual heroes, even though Latin America is actually known for being the place where the most climate environmentalists are being murdered for their heroism. So there is this place for a prophetic denunciation. But I think that the most powerful, potent possibility of transformation is communal. It is about how we live together and embody that which we see as ideal.
I wonder if you could put a bit more flesh on those bones so our imaginations could enter a little bit more deeply into your experiment. Would you tell us a bit about the rhythm of one particular day in Casa Adobe? What does that look like?
So Casa Adobe, we begin our weekdays with morning prayer. And this is not just a ritual, this is a life-giving strand that helps us keep our imagination properly tweaked. So a moment of communal prayer before we go into our daily business. There is an older woman, political asylee from Venezuela, who is unable to get a job outside the community, so she spends her time gardening. I just got through a very bad stomach flu that had me very under the weather. This is my first day back at work for a few days. And she's the one giving me all these proper potions to get my belly settled. And I mentioned her because we have a common purse for our regular expenses. She can't contribute monetarily. She contributes through caring for us. Others have jobs outside. I'm a professor with Western Theological Seminary. All my work with A Rocha is volunteer. So when I get off this call, I'll be back looking at my students' postings and preparing my classes for the next few weeks and such. So we find different means to sustain us economically, but we all share this common pot, so we don't have a portion of the fridge for each family. We are one big family. And yes, we recycle our gray waters. We put in double plumbing so that the water from the showers goes to the toilets. And we have solar panels so that we heat our water passively with the sun. We work at composting. And we compost for our neighbors who don't have space to have a composter. And then we're able to give them some nicely fertilized soil for their plants. We all share dinner. Most of the day, everybody goes about their business, but then we cook for one another. We take turns. And our meal times are very important times of sharing and inspiring one another in this vision. And the conversations are about how do we live in the midst of all of this. And we have these long after dinner conversations. Some of the members of our community are young people who are volunteering for a period And this is where a lot of the formation happens, just around the table in the conversations and such. Sunday evenings, we do have an intentional worship time. So last night, I think we were 28 people, many, many young people. Some neighbors who are not even believers, but are attracted by the depth of commitment we have to the neighborhood and to creation. And so they're attracted to it, and they come with questions, and they come to know about what a difference Jesus can make in our lives. So there's also that dimension. And yes, it's work. It can be exhausting, but we also give each other space to be introverts when we need to. So we have little corners of the house where people can retreat when they're done with being so on all the time. Yeah, it's a very organic process of building and nourishing an alternative imaginary about what the good life is.
As you described your community, what came to mind was ecology. It really is an ecological community in the sense that it's all about sharing, identifying the strengths of each member of the community and picking those up and giving opportunities for sharing. So very much like an ecology dynamic that you're trying to live by.
And when you say that, one thing that comes to mind, a little story. One of our members is a young boy who is 11 years old, and he's on the autism spectrum. And on my turns to cook, I used to just put my earplugs in and listen to podcasts. So I'm cooking and I'm listening to a podcast, but he would show up in the kitchen. And I realized, this is my time to be with Tuti. And Tuti, he just wants company. And so he is learning to cook and to chop up tomatoes, and he'll suggest things. Oh, why don't you add a little bit of this or a little bit of that? And we can envision him growing into a chef. That's that ecological sense of people with different kinds of gifts and different needs, but we can learn to be there for each other in particular ways.
You know, when I first got the vision for ecological community, Joe, when your parents were teaching our courses up at Regent College, they did such a good job of explaining what that kind of interactive, interdependent community looked like, but also being really honest about the fact that it took a lot of work. That community is hard work. So I think people sometimes go into intentional community with a sense like, oh, I'm going to live in paradise, right?
It'll be like heaven, but then you're like, oh, but there's like unredeemed people.
That's it. We're all human.
The closer you get, the more of your own ugliness comes out, doesn't it?
I'm blessed to be part of this experiment. My husband and I have been at it since we came to Costa Rica. This is it. This is where we're called to be. It's very sustaining. Though it is a lot of work, it is good to have a real sense of vocation. This is where we're called to be and to keep it going. So we're grateful for it.
Friends, I hope that our conversation with Joe Swinney of A Rocha International and Ruth Padilla deBorst of A Rocha Costa Rica left you both curious and inspired to consider what communities of witness and resistance might look like in the places where you live. I love it that Ruth refers to the Casa Adobe community as essentially experimental. In fact, it's only by taking risks to practice what Ruth calls alternative modes that we can discover the most system-challenging, truth-embodying, creation-embracing ways of doing life together that can actually make a difference to the broad community of creation in our places. So maybe our best takeaway from this conversation might be the challenge to think outside the bounds of our expectations in terms of what community looks like and what it's for. Now, maybe for you, community might mean figuring out a way to live in common spaces with others of like heart and mind. You know, Circlewood was birthed out of an intentional community called Mustard Seed House, led by our founders, Tom and Christine Sine. Maybe, like them, you're someone who already has a house with room to spare. What would it look like for you to invite others to live in purposeful community? Of course, community can take all kinds of forms and functions. In our recent episode with Christy Berghoff, you might recall, she encouraged people to actively seek out others like them who care about the environment or social justice issues so that we don't feel alone in doing the good work that must be done, but also so that our combined efforts and shared passions are ultimately way more effective in enacting change we want to see and be. Finally, as we ponder the power and potential of community life in the coming days, we should think expansively and inclusively and ask, what are the practical, actionable ways we can build communities that include the more than human members that make up the ecologies of our places? And how do we make room for them at the table? Those are the kinds of questions, friends, that lead us to more beautiful, mutual, and sustainable ways of doing life together. And Birthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood. Our executive producer is James Amidon, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our communications manager, and our music was created by Forrest Reed and Levgen Potovsky. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent listening to this episode. Help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform, and be sure to go to earthkeepers.online to sign up for our podcast newsletter. And if you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers Podcast.